Welcome to Nourish Your Biblical Roots Special Edition. I'm Bishop Paul Lanier, Chairman of the Board of Directors for the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews. We're broadcasting live from NRB, the National Religious Broadcasters Convention. And during our time together, we're talking to some very special people on a variety of topics, especially as it relates to Israel, Jewish-Christian relations, and the work of the fellowship. Today, I have the glorious privilege of welcoming to the podcast a dear friend of the fellowship and a fellow member of the board of directors, a tremendous advocate for Israel, an influential evangelical leader, and a tireless advocate for peace and religious freedom throughout the Middle East, Johnnie Moore. Johnnie, thank you so much, sir, for taking the time and making the time and coming by the table and just sharing a few moments with us. It's always great to spend time with you.
Bishop, it's my privilege, and even when I accidentally ran into you when I first arrived in RB, it was like something jumped inside of me, and I think it's because of this mission that we share together.
Yes, sir. All right, this is what I want to know. Johnnie Moore and Israel. Talk to me about Johnnie Moore and the whole planet of Israel.
You know, it's interesting. I think like lots of Christians growing up in the South and in the United States, I had a good feeling about Israel. You know, I grew up in a church that taught the Bible.
Yes.
I always say I have a lot of Bible verses memorized,
Yes.
not because I intentionally did it, but I had a pastor who taught the Bible, and back
right.
then we went to church 3 times a week: Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night.
That's
and
exactly right.
And in the Deep South, though, like, I loved Israel. I felt good about the Jewish people, but I didn't meet a Jewish person until I was an adult. And I didn't travel to Israel till I was an adult. And so I think it's sort of a remarkable thing that our churches, particularly our evangelical churches, we almost accidentally create these Zionists as they grow up in their faith. But as I became an adult, and I started to get to know the Jewish community, and I started going to Israel again and again and again, I found so much of my faith come alive through that experience. So that's how I came to Israel in my own life experience. But Israel has impacted me far more than almost anything else. I almost can't think of my life inseparable from Israel in some ways.
But when did it become such a passion to you? Like you said, it was inevitably, almost innately in our mother's milk. We sat in Sunday school and we knew the names of the characters of Scripture, and but there came that moment to where I've got to be there. And when did it become such a passion to you? And what made that happen?
Yeah, it was like several factors. But when I first went, it's like all the pieces came together, and I felt like I was like living in the Bible, not just reading the Bible. I'd gone to school and gotten degrees in the Bible, but I was like living inside of it. And then I had, like, separate from my own biblical Christian experience with Israel, I had these like profound experiences with the Jewish community. When I first attended a Shabbat dinner.
Wow.
When I later on, I was at a dinner where the former chief rabbi of Israel, Rabbi Lau, told his story as a Holocaust survivor and how he was cared for by Christians. I remember the first time I went to the wall. I remember sitting together with a rabbi friend of mine studying the Old Testament together, reading in the same book that we shared all kinds of insights that I just didn't know because I didn't know Hebrew. So it's just been one thing after another. And what I found is basically an endless well of fellowship, of education, of spiritual experiences. It has only deepened my faith. And it's also only made me a more zealous advocate for Israel, because in the Bible we have in the New Testament this phrase that every Christian knows, that the truth will make you free. And I'm sort of like flabbergasted when I read about Israel sometimes in the newspaper based upon my own experiences, and the truth freed my mind and showed me reality on the ground. and what I believe to be true about the Bible, has only deepened through my experience studying it together with actually rabbi friends of mine.
It's amazing when I ask you, what was the passion? What changed it for you? And inevitably, it went to relationships.
Yeah, that's
I
right.
sat at this wall with this rabbi, had this conversation. So let me ask you, how are we doing? Jewish-Christian relations. How are we doing?
I mean, I think if you could like get into a teleportation machine and go back to different parts of human history, and you sat down with Jews in Europe or in other places, and you describe to them the reality of our experience today, they would not believe you. Yeah. It would be totally unfathomable. Yeah. The strength of the relationship between the Christian and Jewish community. On the same token, we can't take that for granted. No, I mean, I'm always telling Christians, in fact, at this very convention, I spoke last year at their Israel breakfast, and I was telling evangelicals, the greatest friends of Israel among the global Christian community, which is pretty good because there are about 800 million of us. I was telling them, like, we can't just talk about the wonderful relationship we share with the Jewish people. Like, we need to, in the state of Israel, we need to educate our children and our grandchildren and the stories of previous generations. We need to tell them to future generations that it is unusual in history to have the experience we're having now. Because the fact is, as a good Jewish friend of mine says, like, most of history, about every 70 years, somebody decided they wanted to commit a genocide against the Jews, and most of the time it was a Christian. And we need to educate our children now on the whole story, so that we don't take for granted this amazing fellowship, as we said, at the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews. Like every relationship, it has to be nurtured and strengthened over time. And we are in a grand time in history between Jewish and Christians, of Jewish and Christian friendship. And everything looks good on the horizon. It only looks like it's deepening, but that only happens intentionally. And we have to teach our children.
And we talk about the miracle, and it really is, of course, of the rebirthing, and after so much chaos, confusion, anguish, suffering. And we, the Christians, were responsible 1900, 2,000 years ago, trying to sever the language, Shabbat, the festival, stripping the Jewishness, even from the Jewish people. And for them to have been able to grab it back, but what's amazing is for us to have been the ones who were so guilty. I think it's just as much a miracle that we're a part of this restoration.
So I tell I spent 13 years in a university, and I would tell my students, I tell my own friends, like, I am not responsible for the sins of the previous generation. But I am responsible for what I allow the next generation to inherit, and I thank God that we're living in a different time, and yet through most of history, this hasn't been the story, and we should be vigilant. But it's not going to happen because of like political alliances. Yeah, it's true. The United States, best friend of Israel. There's no greater ally of the United States, and it's not just Israel benefiting from the United States. I think most Americans would be totally shocked if they understood all the ways America is safer and more prosperous because of the relationship with Israel. We wouldn't know America the way we know America without Israel. But politics isn't going to do it.
No, sir.
Casual friendships over dinner and your neighbor, not going to do it.
No,
What's going to do it is shared values. It's going to be serving people in need together. It's going to be studying the Bible together. It's going to be responding together to the world that we live in together.
Yes, sir.
And that's happening. It's happening all the time. And one of the reasons why it's happening, Bishop, is because of this organization.
Yes.
The International Fellowship of Christians and Jews is a historic organization. It pioneered the relationship between the Jewish and Christian community.
Yes, it did.
It was not easy to do.
No.
Our beloved rabbi, your lifelong and dear friend, may his memory be a blessing. When he decided to build that bridge, it was controversial, and he went out in front and he did the hard work. And now, as we sit here, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Christians that wake up every day, pray, millions, in fact, that wake up praying for Israel. They support Israel. They do all of these things. It's incredible. But what brings us together is our shared values.
Yes, sir.
To serve the needy around the world, to
Yes,
stand
sir.
up for what's right, to try to raise our children in a way that honors God and where they treat one another
sir.
with respect to leave the world a better place. I think that's the core of the relationship. It's not the fact that the U.S. provided refuge for so many members of the Jewish community in a horrible time in history. It's not the geopolitical relation. None of that. It is that our hearts are knit together because we share a common Judeo-Christian story.
Yes. You know, Johnny, you were noting a moment ago about your own, that you had worked on a university campus for over a decade. And that's what I want to step into from talking about nations to generations. And one without the other won't work. How is it, and you've seen it and been frustrated, we send young people who are Zionists and then they go to a university campus and boom, they lose all sense of self and not just about in their faith, they lose everything, their sense of identity, self. How do we reach as a former, and I'm sure you're still participating at some level perhaps in the university system, but how do we maintain and sustain faith and a passion for Israel in the next generation?
Well, first of all, I actually believe it's not as bad as all the naysayers think it is. I think generations. There's a statistical generation decline among young evangelicals supporting Israel. That statistical decline is interesting. If we're going from like 80% to like 75%, like I'm not conceding a percentage point. I don't want to concede an inch, but like it's still like almost all of them.
Yes.
And I think number one, we can't believe our own sort of like press on this. But number two, look, I mean, it's not just, we can't look at this through a geopolitical lens. We have to look at it through, as you said, Bishop, through the lens of relationship. And those relationships are relationships of shared values, of a shared story, of I mean, it's hard to be a religious person, for instance, at a secular campus. It's harder to be alone with whatever you believe in an environment where you're isolated. And a friend of mine who's a counselor always says that the remedy for trauma is community. And I think we could do a lot more to make sure that young Christians aren't like I was as a kid, which was I felt good about the Jewish people. I loved Israel, but I didn't know anyone. I'd never been there, and something magically changes when you have as a Christian, when you have Jewish friends, and when Jews have Christian friends, and then they live life together.
How do we, though, when it comes to our young people, our kids, our children, our grandchildren, what is the process for maybe people who have not been as engaged in Israel in the whole narrative as you have been and are? What do we say to that generation, our children coming up? How do we keep them not just plugged in, but passionate about it?
I think the wrong word is the word say. I think the right word is the word do. And and sorry to go back to the organization that we love, but what the fellowship does is it allows you to do something about what you care about.
Yes.
So, by the way, our pastors should talk about these things in their pulpits.
Oh, totally.
Exactly. I actually think it's kind of remarkable how many pastors talk about Israel by teaching the Bible every single weekend and don't talk about Israel, in the reality of the world that we're living in. But it's more than just feeling something or saying something or learning something. All that's important, but there's an extra level to it, which is when your life is commingled with it, and that happens through action very often. And it's not just that I can care about Israel; it's that I can wake up and I can give to the fellowship and help an elderly Jewish widow flee Ukraine or make aliyah from some persecuted European country.
Yes,
we have all these amazing stories of there's so many that are my own favorites. You know, one of mine is of a rabbi in a European country that was attacked by an extremist, and oddly enough, a biblical book, you know, was used to repel the extremists, and he had lived in this increasing anti-Semitism in this period of his life, and yet because of the fellowship, you know, they were able to rebuild their life in Israel. It's a doing. It's not just believing or saying or whatever. When the terrorists start sending the rockets, like, you know, we had a volunteer in Israel who's helped a lot of people, and the rockets start flying, and all of a sudden he's not just a volunteer, he's a potential victim, and he doesn't know where a shelter is, and all of a sudden, what does he see? He sees the fellowship logo, and here he is. He's being saved by his own good deeds.
Yes.
And I think in the same way we are saved by our own good deeds, and not in a theological sense as a Christian, but in a practical sense as we move from something that we feel good about it, that we talk about into action. That's what the fellowship does. I always tell you, Al, our friend and, you know, the leader of the fellowship, say the gift the fellowship gives to Christians is they're the bridge. You know, they allow us to do something about what we care about, and I think, Israel aside, the Jewish-Christian relationship aside, if you want a next generation, if you want children that carry on the heritage of your family, that carry on your faith, that carry on your legacy, it will happen through doing life together, not just setting expectations and talking about them.
Well, I've already run out of time. But before I close, I want to say this. We've talked about Israel and talked about nations and generations. What I haven't said is Johnnie has his finger on the pulse as good as anybody you're going to ever meet about dialogues internationally. I remember we were on a bus in October, I think it was, in Israel. And I'm about to get off the bus, and I look at Johnnie. I say, Johnnie, who keeps you up at night? Who scares you? Who is the international leader that's out? And I won't reveal the answer because that was a private conversation we were having. But immediately he was able to share insight that I was oblivious to. And so I'm so grateful to you for who you are in the body, in the people of God, and the gravitas you bring to the board, to the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews. And I just pray that God continues to provide you access and favor and multiplied with instant intimacies in some of these things that would just be pure miraculous. And I thank you for taking the time to be with us now.
Bishop, just to put a bow tie on what you just said, a good friend of mine who's a mentor of mine and a rabbi, he gave me a word of advice one time. He said, as an American, he said, there's almost no issue in the world that you care about that you can't make a difference in just because of your American passport. You take that American passport and you get on a plane and you go meet people. And any contribution I've made to the world is just because of the mentorship of good friends and the amazing privilege of living in a country like the United States. And the United States is what it is. I was just reading on the airplane coming over George Washington's letter to the Jewish community in Savannah, Georgia. They congratulated him after his election, and he sent them a letter back, and the warmth in that letter is incredible, but what's especially poignant about it is he is unashamed that the reason why the United States, in its infancy and now in its prosperity, has the success and makes the difference in the world that it does is because of our shared Judeo-Christian heritage. So we all benefit from what's come before us, and that's what we're working on together to make sure that continues on after us. So thanks for having me.
Thank you, Johnnie. God bless you all.